Standing on the edge of a bridge, one step away from ending it all, wealthy businessman Edward Milner had lost everything: his company, his reputation, his will to live. What could possibly make him step back from the abyss? The answer comes in the most unexpected form: a barefoot 8-year-old girl in a faded purple dress, sitting on the 17th step of the bridge, who utters 9 words that shatter his world. "If you die, my mom will too." Who is this mysterious child with eyes too wise for her years? Why does she have a photograph of Edward from decades ago? And what dark secrets connect them across time? Secrets powerful enough to bring a broken man back from the edge of death. As Edward steps away from his planned suicide, he's drawn into a web of decades-old lies, manipulated documents, and hidden truths that will force him to question everything he thought he knew about his past and everything he believes about himself. Don't miss this heart-wrenching story of redemption, family secrets, and second chances that will keep you guessing until the very end. Follow our channel for more emotional stories that will touch your soul, and be sure to like and comment to let us know where you're watching from. The thick fog rose from the river like icy fingers enveloping the iron bridge. The muffled sound of distant cars was the only sign that the city still breathed. On the 17th step of the bridge's side staircase, a barefoot girl in a faded purple dress and brown hair, barely held by a worn elastic band, dangled her thin legs over the void, hugging a crumpled paper bag. She gazed at the horizon with large, silent eyes. On the other side of the structure, Edward Milner, 62, his Italian suit soaked with rain, stared into the abyss with the coldness of someone who had already died inside. The newspapers would talk about bankruptcy, betrayal, scandal, but only he knew that what dragged him there was the silence of abandonment. When he took the first step to climb onto the ledge, a sweet, childish, and unexpectedly firm voice cut through the darkness. "Mister, if you die, my mom will too." He stopped. The world stopped. He turned slowly. The girl stared at him with surprising gravity. "She says the father in the picture had your eyes, and your pain too." Edward staggered. His heart pounded against his ribs as he gripped the railing tighter, his knuckles turning white. The night air felt suddenly heavier, pressing against his lungs. Had he imagined it? Was his mind already slipping away, creating phantoms at the edge of the abyss? But no, the girl remained there, real and solid, her gaze unwavering. "What did you say?" His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. The girl hugged her paper bag closer to her chest. "Mom keeps your picture under her pillow. She cries sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping." She spoke with the blunt honesty only children possess, each word hitting Edward like a physical blow. He took an unsteady step away from the ledge, drawn by an invisible force toward this strange child who had appeared from nowhere. The fog swirled between them, creating an otherworldly scene: a wealthy man in expensive clothes and a barefoot girl on a bridge at midnight. What bizarre twist of fate was this? "Who are you?" Edward managed to ask, his voice shaking. "Who is your mother?" The girl tilted her head slightly, studying him with eyes that seemed too old for her young face. "My name is Amelia," she said. "Mom says I wasn't supposed to tell you that. She says you wouldn't care anyway." Amelia. The name echoed in the chambers of Edward's heart, stirring memories buried so deeply he'd convinced himself they were dreams. Impossible coincidences collided in his mind. He had once chosen that name years ago, in another life. "That's a beautiful name," he managed, taking another step toward her, afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. The rain began to fall harder now, the drops mixing with the tears Edward hadn't realized were streaming down his face. What cruel joke was this? After losing everything, his company, his reputation, his will to live, was he now losing his mind as well? "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, suddenly aware of how dangerous the bridge was for a child her age. "Where is your mother? Does she know you're here?" Amelia shook her head. "Mom's working the late shift at the warehouse. She thinks I'm with Mrs. Patterson next door, but Mrs. Patterson fell asleep watching her shows." She looked down at the churning water far below. "I come here sometimes. The bridge feels safe." Edward nearly laughed at the irony. The same bridge he'd chosen for his final exit was this child's sanctuary. He glanced at his watch, almost midnight, then back at the girl's thin arms and bare feet. "You're freezing," he said, removing his expensive suit jacket and cautiously approaching her. "May I?" When she nodded, He gently draped the jacket over her shoulders. It engulfed her tiny frame, making her look even smaller. "How did you know I'd be here?" he asked, sitting down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. Amelia's eyes grew distant. "I didn't, but Mom said this is where you two first met, on the 17th step." She patted the concrete beneath them. "She made a promise here." Edward's breath caught in his throat. The 17th step? He'd chosen this spot at random, or so he thought. His mind raced through fragments of memories, trying to piece together a puzzle with too many missing parts. "I don't understand," he admitted, both to the girl and to himself. The wind howled around them, carrying the distant wail of a police siren. Amelia reached into her paper bag and withdrew something wrapped in tissue paper. With delicate movements that belied her young age, she unfolded the layers to reveal a photograph, its edges worn and one corner stained with what looked like coffee. "Mom says I'm not supposed to show this to anyone," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the storm. "But you're not just anyone, are you?" She held out the photograph with a solemnity that made Edward's hands tremble as he accepted it. The street lamp cast just enough light for him to make out two figures, a younger version of himself, perhaps 25 years ago, standing beside a beautiful woman with a radiant smile. They were on this very bridge, arms wrapped around each other, looking invincible and in love. Edward's world tilted on its axis. The woman in the photograph, he recognized her, yet couldn't place her. Like a dream remembered upon waking, only to slip away moments later. "Who?" he began, but his voice failed him. "That's my mom," Amelia said simply. "Before I was born, before you left." The implication hit Edward like a physical blow. He stared at the photo, then at the child beside him, searching for resemblances, for proof, for denial. "What's your mother's name?" he asked, barely able to form the words. "Lynn," Amelia replied, watching his reaction carefully. "Lynn Carter. Lynn Carter." The name opened a floodgate of memories. A summer romance, passionate and intense. A whirlwind affair before his arranged marriage to the daughter of his father's business partner. Lynn had been a college student then, working part-time at his father's company. Beautiful, intelligent, from the wrong side of town. His father had made it clear, end it or lose everything. And like the coward he was, Edward had chosen wealth over love. He'd cut all ties, changed his number, moved across the country. He'd convinced himself it was a youthful indiscretion, nothing more. Had buried it so deeply that even now, facing the evidence, his mind struggled to accept the truth. "It's impossible," he whispered, more to himself than to Amelia. "Mom says nothing's impossible," Amelia countered, her small face serious. "Just improbable." A crack of thunder split the sky, making them both jump. The rain was coming down in sheets now, the wind driving it sideways across the bridge. "We need to get you home," Edward said, standing up and offering his hand. Self-destruction could wait. Right now, this child, this impossible, miraculous child, needed to be safe. Amelia hesitated before taking his hand. "Are you still going to jump?" The directness of the question struck him like a slap. He began, then stopped. What could he say to that? "Because if you are," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "I'll have to stay here with you. And I'm really, really cold." Something broke inside Edward then. The ice that had encased his heart for decades, the numbness that had allowed him to climb onto that ledge in the first place. A laugh escaped him, rusty and surprised. "No, Amelia," he said, marveling at how easily her name came to his lips. "I'm not going to jump. Not tonight, at least." She nodded, satisfied, and slipped her tiny hand into his. "Good, because Mom needs you, even if she pretends she doesn't." She looked up at him, rain plastering her hair to her forehead. "And I think maybe you need us too." As they walked away from the edge, Edward felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. Whether this child was truly his, whether Lynn would even speak to him after all this time, these were questions for tomorrow. Tonight he had been given a reason to see the sunrise. Behind them, the 17th step of the bridge stood empty, a silent witness to what might have been the end of one story, and was now perhaps the beginning of another. The morning light filtered through the dusty blinds of Edward's hotel room, casting long shadows across the rumpled bedsheets. He hadn't slept. How could he? With his mind racing through the events of the previous night, the bridge, the ledge, the girl, Amelia. Her name echoed in his thoughts like a forgotten melody suddenly remembered. Edward sat at the edge of the bed, the coffee-stained photograph held gingerly between his trembling fingers. Lynn Carter. 25 years had passed since he'd whispered that name. 25 years of burying memories under ambition, wealth, and eventually, despair. Now the past had resurfaced in the form of a barefoot child on the 17th step of the bridge, where he'd once planned to end everything. After walking Amelia back to her building, a crumbling apartment complex in the city's forgotten district, Edward had promised to return the following day. The girl had made him swear on the photograph, her small face solemn in the rain. "Mom works double shifts on Tuesdays," she'd told him, her voice matter-of-fact. "She won't be home until 7. You can come at 3. Now, as the digital clock on the nightstand flashed 2:45 p.m., Edward straightened his tie for the 5th time. He'd exchanged his rain-soaked Italian suit for a more modest outfit, charcoal slacks and a navy button-down that wouldn't scream wealthy in a neighborhood where such displays could be dangerous. The less attention he drew, the better. His phone buzzed incessantly. 17 missed calls from his lawyer, 8 from his financial advisor. The vultures were circling what remained of Milner Enterprises, eager to pick the bones clean before the bankruptcy became official. Yesterday, those calls had driven him to the bridge. Today, they seemed distant, almost irrelevant. With one last glance at the photograph, Edward slipped it into his pocket and headed out. The neighborhood looked different in daylight, more worn, more hopeless. Abandoned storefronts with faded signs stood like ghosts of prosperity long past. Graffiti covered nearly every surface, territorial markings in vibrant colors declaring ownership of forgotten spaces. Edward kept his head down, acutely aware of curious glances from residents unaccustomed to seeing someone with his bearing in their midst. As he rounded the corner toward Amelia's building, something caught his eye. On a crumbling wall across the street, spray-painted in bold red letters, were the words, "De Grau 17, Promessa de Vida, Step 17, Promise of Life." Edward stopped cold, his breath catching. It couldn't be coincidence. He quickly snapped a picture with his phone, making a mental note to investigate later. The building's entrance had no security, the lock long since broken. The elevator was out of service, permanently, judging by the rust on the call button. Edward climbed 5 flights of stairs, the smell of damp concrete and old cooking oil growing stronger with each floor. Apartment 5C had a door that had seen better days, the peeling blue paint revealing layers of colors beneath, a history of half-hearted renovations. Edward hesitated, then knocked softly. The door opened almost immediately, as if Amelia had been waiting just behind it. Her face lit up when she saw him, and something warm and unfamiliar unfurled in Edward's chest. "You came," she said, not bothering to hide her surprise. "I promised," Edward replied simply. The apartment was small but meticulously clean. Mismatched furniture had been arranged with care, and colorful drawings were taped to the walls. Amelia's work, he presumed. A faint smell of lavender hung in the air, fighting against the building's pervasive mustiness. "Would you like some juice?" Amelia offered, suddenly playing the role of hostess. "Mom says we should always offer visitors something to drink." "I'd love some," Edward said, following her into the tiny kitchenette where she stood on tiptoes to reach a glass. While Amelia carefully poured apple juice from a half-empty container, Edward noticed a small shelf beside the refrigerator. On it sat several framed photographs, most featuring Amelia at different ages. But one frame was turned face down. "Why is that picture like that?" he asked, pointing. Amelia's expression clouded. "Mom turns it down when she's sad. She turns it up when she's hopeful." She handed him the juice. "It's been down for a long time now." With a child's lack of boundaries, she picked up the frame and handed it to Edward. "It's you," she said matter-of-factly. "The sad man from the bridge." The photograph was older than the one Amelia had shown him the night before. In this one, Edward stood alone by a fountain, laughing at something beyond the camera's view. He recognized the location, Westfield Park, where he'd first met Lynn during her lunch break. He'd been 28 then, already rising through the ranks of his father's company, but still capable of genuine laughter. "Your mom kept this all these years?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Amelia nodded. "She says it reminds her that you weren't always the man who left." The words struck like physical blows. Edward carefully set the frame upright on the shelf, a gesture that felt symbolic in ways he couldn't articulate. "Amelia," he began carefully, "about your mother, and about me. You want to know if you're my dad?" she interrupted, her directness startling. Mom says you might be, she's not sure. Edward blinked, caught off guard by her frankness. She told you that? Amelia shrugged. Not exactly. I heard her talking to Aunt Rebecca once. She said she never got the chance to tell you about me before you disappeared. The girl studied him with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. Do you think you could be my dad? The question hung in the air between them, impossibly heavy for such small words. Edward knelt down to her level, searching for an answer that wouldn't hurt her. I don't know, he admitted finally, but I'd like to find out, if that's okay with you and your mom. Amelia considered this, her small face serious. I think that's fair, she decided. Then without warning, she took his hand and led him to the worn couch. I want to show you something important. From beneath a cushion, she withdrew a battered shoebox. Inside was a collection of treasures only a child would value. Colorful stones, a few seashells, movie ticket stubs. But buried among them was an envelope, yellowed with age and stained with what looked like dried tears. Mom doesn't know I found this, Amelia whispered, her voice suddenly small. It was in her special box under the bed. With trembling fingers, she extracted a folded letter and handed it to Edward. The handwriting was painfully familiar. Lynn's flowing script, though more youthful than he remembered. Dear Edward, it began. By the time you read this, I'll be... The rest of the sentence was obscured by a coffee stain. The ink blurred beyond recognition. Edward's heart hammered against his ribs as he carefully unfolded the rest. But several more sections were illegible, damaged by what must have been years of storage in less than ideal conditions. He could make out fragments. Doctor confirmed today, and wanted you to know, and most devastatingly, our child deserves... Edward looked up to find Amelia watching him intently. Did you read this? He asked. She shook her head. I can't read cursive yet. Mom says I'll learn next year in school. She hesitated. Is it important? Yes, Edward said softly. I think it's very important, but I can't read all of it. Some of the words are damaged. Before Amelia could respond, a key turned in the lock. They both froze as the door swung open, revealing a woman whose face Edward hadn't seen in 25 years. Except in dreams, he pretended not to remember. Lynn Carter stood in the doorway, still in her warehouse uniform. Exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She was older, thinner than he remembered, her once vibrant auburn hair now streaked with premature gray. But her eyes, those eyes that had once looked at him with such love, were exactly the same, widening now with shock, then narrowing with a fury that made Edward take a step back. What the hell are you doing in my home? Her voice was ice, each word precisely enunciated. Amelia rushed forward. Mom, I found him at the bridge just like in your stories. He was going to jump, but I stopped him. Lynn's face drained of color. She grabbed Amelia by the shoulders, her eyes never leaving Edward's face. Go to your room, Amelia. Now. But Mom. Now, Amelia. The girl looked between them, her lower lip trembling, then reluctantly obeyed, casting one last pleading look at Edward, before disappearing down the short hallway. The moment they were alone, Lynn advanced on him, her voice a controlled whisper of rage. 25 years. 25 years of silence, and now you just appear in my daughter's life? Lynn, I didn't know, Edward began. I swear to you I had no idea. Get out, she cut him off. Whatever game you're playing, whatever you think you're doing here, it stops now. My daughter has been through enough without you waltzing in to satisfy some midlife crisis curiosity. Edward stood his ground despite every instinct telling him to retreat. She found me, Lynn, on that bridge. She saved my life. Something flashed in Lynn's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or fear. She glanced toward the shelf where the photograph now stood upright. Her hands began to shake. The 17th step, she whispered, almost to herself. You were really going to jump. Edward nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Lynn sank into a chair, suddenly looking much older than her years. Why now? She asked, her voice hollow. After all this time, why now? I lost everything, Edward admitted. My company, my reputation. I thought there was nothing left to live for. He pulled out the stained letter from his pocket. Until Amelia found me. Until I saw this. Lynn's eyes fixed on the letter, recognition dawning in her expression. Where did you get that? Amelia found it in your room, he said gently. She didn't read it, but I tried to. Most of it's damaged. Lynn's laugh was bitter. edged with decades of pain. Of course it is. That's how my luck runs. She extended her hand. Give it to me. Edward hesitated, then surrendered the letter. Lynn held it for a long moment without looking at it, her gaze distant. Was I? Edward began, then faltered. He tried again. Is Amelia my daughter? Lynn's eyes met his, a storm of emotions swirling in their depths. I don't know, she said finally. And that's the God's honest truth, Edward. I truly don't know. 3 days had passed since the confrontation in Lynn's apartment. 3 days of Edward pacing his hotel room, making calls to postpone meetings with bankruptcy lawyers, and staring at the photograph of a younger, happier version of himself. 3 days of wondering if the small girl with perceptive eyes was truly his daughter. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean, but still gray. Edward stood across the street from Riverdale Storage and Shipping, a sprawling warehouse complex where Lynn had worked for the past 8 years, according to the information he'd discreetly obtained from the apartment building's talkative superintendent. The facility was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with rusting barbed wire, the concrete loading docks crowded with workers in identical Navy uniforms. He spotted her during the lunch break, her auburn hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, her thin frame bent slightly as she sat alone on a bench unwrapping a sandwich from aluminum foil. Even from a distance, Edward could see the exhaustion in her posture, the weight of years pressing down on her shoulders. His heart twisted with a complicated mixture of guilt, regret, and something dangerously close to longing. When Lynn looked up and saw him standing there, her body went rigid. For a moment, Edward thought she might simply ignore him. Instead, after a long pause, she stood and walked slowly to the fence that separated them. You shouldn't be here, she said quietly, her fingers curling around the metal links between them. I needed to talk to you, Edward replied, without Amelia present. Lynn's eyes darted nervously to her co-workers, several of whom were watching with undisguised curiosity. I have 15 minutes, she conceded. Walk with me. She led him around the corner to a small, dingy coffee shop frequented by warehouse workers. The place smelled of burnt coffee and grease, its plastic tables scarred with cigarette burns from the days when indoor smoking was still permitted. Lynn chose a table in the back corner, positioning herself so she could watch the door. Old habits, she explained, catching Edward's questioning look. Single mom in a rough neighborhood. You learn to always watch the exits. A waitress with tired eyes brought them 2 coffees without being asked, nodding to Lynn with the familiarity of routine. When she was gone, an uncomfortable silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken words. Amelia asked about you this morning, Lynn finally said, stirring her coffee absently. Wanted to know when the sad man from the bridge was coming back. Edward winced at the description. What did you tell her? The truth. That I didn't know. Lynn's gaze was steady, challenging. Why are you really here, Edward? After 25 years of silence, why now? Edward ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair, suddenly aware of how much time had passed. I told you the other night. I was going to jump. Amelia stopped me. And what? You suddenly developed a conscience? Decided to see if you'd left behind a child? The bitterness in Lynn's voice was palpable, a living thing between them. I didn't know, Edward insisted, leaning forward. Lynn, you have to believe me. I never received any letter. I never knew you were pregnant. Lynn's laugh was short, devoid of humor. That's convenient. It's the truth. Edward pulled out his phone, swiping to a photo he'd taken. And I need to understand what this means. He showed her the image of the graffiti. De Grau 17, Promessa de Vida. Step 17, Promise of Life. The color drained from Lynn's face. She reached for the phone with trembling fingers, enlarging the image as if searching for some hidden clue within the spray-painted words. Where did you find this? She whispered. 2 blocks from your apartment, on the east wall of that abandoned bakery. Edward watched her reaction carefully. What does it mean, Lynn? What promise? Lynn set the phone down and stared into her coffee as if it might offer answers. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, lost in memory. Fairbrook, Maine, she said. Do you remember it? The name of the small coastal town hit Edward like a physical blow. It was where they'd escaped for a weekend during that long-ago summer, where they'd walked barefoot on empty beaches and made promises neither had kept. Of course I remember, he said softly. There was a lighthouse there, Lynn continued, her eyes still downcast. 17 steps to the top. You said it was symbolic. 17 steps to see forever. Her fingers tightened around her cup. The night before you disappeared, we met on the bridge. The 17th step. You promised me forever there too. Edward closed his eyes, memories washing over him in painful waves. And then I was gone. Without a word. Without a goodbye. Lynn's voice hardened. A week later, I found out I was pregnant. I wrote you letter after letter, they all came back unopened. I never received them, Edward insisted. My father must have... He stopped abruptly, old suspicions suddenly crystallizing into certainty. My father had my mail screened. Anything that might distract me from the family business was handled. Lynn's eyes narrowed. Convenient excuse. It's not an excuse, Edward said firmly. It's what happened. After that weekend in Fairbrook, he threatened to cut me off completely if I didn't end things with you. When I refused, he arranged my promotion to the West Coast office. By the time I realized what he'd done, months had passed and He trailed off, shame coloring his face. And you what? Lynn pressed. And I was a coward, Edward admitted. I convinced myself it was better this way, that you deserved someone who could choose you freely, without sacrificing everything else. Lynn stared at him, her expression unreadable. Your noble sacrifice cost me everything, Edward. Do you have any idea what it was like? 22 years old, pregnant, abandoned, with parents who disowned me for refusing to take care of the problem? Her voice cracked slightly. I was alone, completely alone. Edward reached across the table, an instinctive gesture of comfort, but Lynn pulled her hands away. I'm sorry, he said, knowing how inadequate the words were. I can never undo what happened, but I want to help now. If Amelia is my daughter, that's just it, Lynn interrupted. I don't know if she is. Edward blinked, confused. But you said... I said I was pregnant, Lynn clarified, her voice dropping to a whisper. What I didn't tell you is that after you left in my darkest moment, She paused, struggling visibly. There was someone else. Just once. A mistake born of desperation and abandonment. The revelation hit Edward like a physical blow. He sat back, processing this new information. So Amelia could be yours or his, Lynn confirmed, unable to meet his eyes. I never had the money for a DNA test, and honestly, it didn't matter. She was mine, regardless of who her father was. She finally looked up, her gaze challenging. Does that change things for you? Now that you know she might not carry the precious Milner bloodline? The question stung. But Edward recognized the defensive anger for what it was, the protective instinct of a mother who had fought the world alone for too long. No, he said firmly. It changes nothing. I still want to help. I still want to know her. Lynn studied him skeptically. Why? Your life is in shambles, by your own admission. You were ready to jump off a bridge 3 days ago. Why should I believe you're stable enough to be in Amelia's life? Edward considered the question carefully. Because she gave me a reason to step back from that ledge, he finally said. And that has to count for something. A complicated emotion flickered across Lynn's face. She opened her mouth to respond when her phone buzzed with an incoming text. She checked it, and her expression immediately transformed from guarded to alarmed. It's Amelia's school, she said, already standing. She's in the nurse's office, some kind of accident during recess. Her hands shook as she gathered her things. I have to go, but I can't leave work. We're short-staffed, and if I lose this job, let me take you, Edward said, rising as well. My car's just outside. Lynn hesitated, visibly torn between necessity and pride. Finally, practicality won out. Fine, but this doesn't change anything. As they hurried to Edward's car, Lynn glanced back at the graffiti on the wall, still visible from where they stood. You asked what the promise was, she said quietly. It was that if you ever came back, I'd give you one chance. Just one. For Amelia's sake. Edward opened the car door for her, their eyes meeting over the roof. And have you given me that chance? Lynn's smile was sad, weighted with decades of pain. The jury's still out, she said. But you showing up at the bridge that night on the 17th step, after all these years? It feels like more than coincidence. As they drove toward Amelia's school, Edward couldn't help but wonder if fate, having torn them apart 25 years ago, was now conspiring to bring them back together. And if so, at what cost? Riverside Elementary School stood like a tired sentinel in one of the city's most neglected neighborhoods. The red brick building, once proud and sturdy, now wore its age in peeling paint and cracked windows patched with duct tape. As Edward guided his sleek black Audi into the visitors' parking lot, the contrast between his vehicle and the surroundings couldn't have been more stark. Lynn was out of the car before he'd fully stopped, her worry manifesting as frantic energy. Edward followed at a respectful distance, noting how the school secretary's demeanor changed when Lynn mentioned Amelia's name, softening from bureaucratic indifference to genuine concern. "Room 112, down the hall," the woman directed, her eyes flickering curiously toward Edward before returning to Lynn. "Nothing serious, Mrs. Carter, just a fall during recess. Nurse Wilson is with her now." The nurse's office was small but meticulously clean, the medicinal smell of antiseptic hanging in the air. Amelia sat on a vinyl-covered examination table, her right knee sporting a large adhesive bandage. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw not only her mother but Edward as well. "Mom, and Mr. Edward," she exclaimed, her pained expression momentarily brightening. "You came together?" Lynn rushed to her daughter's side, examining the bandaged knee with the practiced eye of a parent well-versed in childhood injuries. "What happened, sweetheart?" Nurse Wilson, a grandmotherly woman with salt and pepper hair pulled into a tight bun, interjected before Amelia could answer. "Just a playground tumble. The concrete by the swings is quite uneven. We've been asking the district to repave it for years." She cast a pointed look at Edward's expensive suit before continuing. 7 stitches, but she was very brave. Didn't cry once. Amelia beamed at the praise, sitting a little straighter. "I told Nurse Wilson about the time I fell off my bike and got a scar on my chin. That hurt way worse than this." Edward's attention sharpened at the mention of the scar. During their first meeting at Lynn's apartment, he'd noticed the small mark on Amelia's chin but hadn't thought much of it. Now, though, he recalled his own childhood accident, falling from a tree at his family's summer estate, requiring 5 stitches in almost exactly the same spot. Lynn caught his expression and frowned slightly before turning back to the nurse. "Thank you for taking care of her. I'll need to sign her out." "Already prepared the forms," Nurse Wilson replied, handing Lynn a clipboard. As Lynn filled out the paperwork, the nurse addressed Edward directly for the first time. "And you are?" Before Edward could respond, Amelia piped up proudly. "He's my dad. He just found us." The room went deathly silent. Lynn's pen froze mid-signature, and Edward felt the weight of both women's gazes upon him. Nurse Wilson's eyebrows had practically disappeared into her hairline, while Lynn's expression was a complicated mixture of shock, anger, and something that might have been fear. "Amelia," Lynn said carefully, setting down the clipboard. "We've talked about this. Mr. Milner is an old friend. We don't know if, but he looks just like me," Amelia insisted, her childish logic unassailable in her own mind. "We both have the thinking wrinkle right here." She pointed to the space between her eyebrows. "And Ms. Patterson said I have rich people's hands just like his." Edward couldn't help but look at Amelia's hands, delicate, with long fingers that did indeed resemble his own. Something tightened in his chest, a mixture of hope and trepidation. Nurse Wilson, sensing the tension, tactfully excused herself to fetch Amelia's personal items, leaving the 3 of them alone in the suddenly too small office. "I'm sorry," Edward said quietly to Lynn. "I never told her." "It's okay," Lynn interrupted, her voice tight. "We'll discuss this later." She turned to her daughter, plastering on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ready to go home, sweetheart?" The ride back to Lynn's apartment was strained, the silence broken only by Amelia's occasional comments about school and friends, seemingly oblivious to the adult tension filling the car. Edward parked outside the rundown building, uncertainty keeping him in his seat as Lynn helped Amelia out. To his surprise, Lynn leaned back into the car. "Come up," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "We need to talk." The apartment looked different in the afternoon light, smaller, more worn, but somehow warmer. Amelia hobbled to the couch, her bandaged knee making her movements awkward. "Cartoons?" she asked hopefully, looking between the adults. Lynn nodded, turning on their small television. "Just for a while. Mr. Milner and I need to talk in the kitchen." Once they were alone in the tiny kitchenette, separated from Amelia by only a half wall, Lynn's carefully maintained composure cracked. "She's been talking about you nonstop since that night," she whispered furiously. drawing pictures of her dad, telling her friends at school, I can't. She broke off, pressing her fingertips to her temples. This is exactly what I was afraid of. I never told her I was her father, Edward said defensively. I've been very careful about that. It doesn't matter what you said or didn't say, Lynn hissed. She's 8 years old, and she's been praying for a father figure her entire life. Just your presence is enough to... She trailed off, her expression softening into sadness. You have no idea what you're doing to her, showing up like this, playing the hero, when tomorrow or next week, when your crisis has passed, you'll disappear again. The accusation stung, particularly because Edward couldn't guarantee it wasn't true. His life was in shambles, his company facing bankruptcy, his reputation in tatters after his former protege had orchestrated a hostile takeover and publicly accused him of fraud. 3 days ago, he'd been ready to end it all. What right did he have to walk into this child's life to make promises he might not be able to keep? I understand your concern, he said carefully. But I'm not going anywhere, Lynn. Not this time. She studied him, years of hard-earned skepticism evident in her gaze. Why should I believe you? Before Edward could answer, a sharp crash from outside made them both jump. They rushed to the window overlooking the street, where Edward's Audi now sported a spiderweb of cracks across its passenger window. A brick lay on the sidewalk beside it, surrounded by glittering shards of glass. Stay here, Edward ordered, already moving toward the door. Edward, wait, Lynn called after him, but he was already taking the stairs 2 at a time, a forgotten protective instinct driving him forward. The street was empty when he reached his car, whoever had thrown the brick long gone. Edward approached cautiously, glass crunching beneath his expensive shoes. The brick had been wrapped in paper secured with a rubber band. With a growing sense of unease, he carefully removed the paper and unfolded it. The message was typed impersonal. She's not your daughter, but you are everything she has. Edward stood frozen, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air crawled up his spine. Who could have written this? Who even knew he was here? Footsteps behind him made him turn. Lynn stood there, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. What is it? She asked, her eyes darting nervously up and down the empty street. Wordlessly, Edward handed her the note. She read it, her face paling. This doesn't make any sense, she whispered. How would anyone know about Amelia and you? I never told anyone except my sister, and she moved to Arizona years ago. Edward's mind raced. My former CFO, Marcus Wells, he knew about us back then. He was the only one I confided in about our relationship. The one who arranged your transfer to California? Lynn asked, her voice sharp with old pain. Edward nodded grimly. He claimed my father ordered it, but now I wonder. He trailed off, a disturbing thought taking shape. Lynn, what if Marcus intercepted your letters? What if he knew about the pregnancy? Lynn's eyes widened as implications cascaded. But why would he care? Why go to such lengths? Money, Edward said simply. My father's will had a morality clause. Any child born out of wedlock would invalidate my inheritance, unless the child was formally given up for adoption. Understanding dawned on Lynn's face, quickly followed by horror. You think he wanted me to give up my baby? Our baby? It would explain why your letters never reached me, Edward said, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. And why he's trying to frighten me away now. If Amelia is my daughter and we can prove it, she could invalidate the deals he's made since taking over your company. Lynn finished, her analytical mind cutting straight to the core. But this note says she's not your daughter. A bluff, Edward suggested, though uncertainty gnawed at him. Or maybe he knows something we don't. Lynn was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting up to the apartment window where Amelia's silhouette could be seen against the curtain. We need to know for sure, she finally said. For Amelia's sake as much as ours. Edward understood what she was suggesting. A DNA test. Lynn nodded, her expression resolute despite the fear lingering in her eyes. I can't live with not knowing anymore, and neither can she. She gestured to the note still clutched in Edward's hand. Whoever wrote this just made that decision for us. As they stood amid the glittering shards of broken glass, Edward was struck by the metaphor. Fragmented reflections of a past neither of them could fully see. Sharp edges capable of drawing blood, and at the center, a message that might be truth or might be the most dangerous lie of all. 3 weeks had passed since the incident with the brick. 3 weeks of waiting for DNA results, of Edward staying in a modest hotel near Lynn's apartment instead of returning to his penthouse across town. 3 weeks of careful visits with Amelia, always under Lynn's watchful eye, building fragile connections thread by thread. The late October skies had turned leaden and threatening, the air heavy with impending rain. Edward sat on a bench in the small playground near Lynn's apartment, watching Amelia navigate the rusty jungle gym with the fearless agility of childhood. Lynn had reluctantly agreed to let him take Amelia out alone while she caught up on much-needed sleep after a string of night shifts. "Watch this, Mr. Edward," Amelia called, hanging upside down from a metal bar, her dark hair cascading toward the ground. Edward smiled, marveling at how quickly she'd recovered from her knee injury, how resilient children could be in ways adults had long forgotten. He'd spent more time with Amelia in these 3 weeks than he had with any child in his entire life. His marriage to Catherine, the daughter of his father's business partner, had ended after 5 childless years, their relationship as sterile as their attempts at parenthood. Now, watching Amelia's unbridled joy at something as simple as mastering a new playground trick, Edward felt a profound sense of loss for what he'd missed. "Be careful," he cautioned as she swung herself higher. "Remember what your mom said about your knee." Amelia rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "Mom worries too much, I'm practically healed." To demonstrate, she attempted a more complex maneuver, twisting her body in midair as she dismounted from the bar. Edward's heart lurched as her foot caught on the edge of the structure. Amelia tumbled forward, arms pinwheeling wildly as she tried to catch herself. He lunged from the bench but was too far away to prevent her from crashing face-first onto the gravel surface. For one terrible moment, silence hung in the air. Then Amelia let out a wail that pierced Edward's heart. He reached her in 3 long strides, kneeling beside her trembling form. "Let me see, sweetheart," he urged gently, helping her into a sitting position. Blood trickled from a cut on her chin, mixing with the tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face. The sight sent Edward into a peculiar state of déjà vu, a memory of his own father examining a similar wound on his own chin decades ago. "It hurts," Amelia sobbed, her small body shaking. I know," Edward soothed, pulling out his handkerchief to press gently against the cut. "Let's get you cleaned up and then we'll see if you need stitches." The neighborhood clinic was understaffed and overcrowded, a stark reminder of the healthcare disparities Edward had never had to personally confront. He sat with Amelia on hard plastic chairs, her head resting against his shoulder as they waited their turn, his handkerchief now stained crimson against her chin. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice small with pain and guilt. "For what?" Edward asked, surprised. "For getting hurt. For ruining our fun day." Her lower lip trembled dangerously. "Mom's gonna be mad." Edward's heart contracted painfully. "No one is mad at you, Amelia. Accidents happen. That's part of being a kid." He hesitated, then added, "When I was about your age, I fell out of a tree and cut my chin open in almost exactly the same spot." Amelia's eyes widened with interest, momentarily distracted from her pain. "Really? Did you get stitches?" "5 of them," Edward confirmed, touching his own chin where a faint silvery line was still visible if you knew where to look. "My father was furious, not because I was hurt, but because I'd climbed the tree when I was supposed to be at my piano lesson." "That's silly," Amelia declared, with the straightforward judgment of childhood. "Being mad at someone for getting hurt." Edward smiled sadly, remembering his father's cold disapproval. "Yes, it is silly, but some adults forget what it's like to be a child." A nurse finally called Amelia's name, leading them to a small examination room. The doctor, a weary-looking woman with kind eyes, examined the cut with practiced efficiency. "Definitely needs stitches," she announced. "Not too many, maybe 3 or 4. She'll have a small scar, but it should fade with time." As the doctor prepared her supplies, she asked Edward to help position Amelia's face in better light. "Just hold her chin steady right where that old scar is." Edward's fingers froze against Amelia's skin. "What old scar?" The doctor pointed to a tiny, almost imperceptible mark just beneath the fresh cut. "This little one here? Looks like a childhood injury that healed quite nicely." With gentle fingers, Edward tilted Amelia's chin, examining the mark more carefully. His breath caught in his throat. The position, the shape, it was identical to his own childhood scar. Not similar, not reminiscent, but identical, down to the slightly curved edge where the stitches had pulled the skin together. "Is something wrong?" the doctor asked, noting his sudden stillness. Edward shook his head, forcing his voice past the lump in his throat. No, nothing. Please, go ahead. While the doctor worked, numbing the area and carefully placing each stitch, Edward's mind raced with implications. He'd seen photos of Lynn's ex-boyfriend, the other potential father, a stocky, square-jawed man with no visible scars. What were the odds that Amelia would have an identical chin scar to his own, in exactly the same location? As they left the clinic, the sky finally unleashed its burden, rain falling in heavy sheets that forced them to dash for Edward's car. Inside, with the rhythmic drumming of raindrops on the roof creating a cocoon of privacy, Edward studied Amelia's profile as she gazed out the window, her new bandage stark white against her skin. "Amelia," he began carefully, "that old scar on your chin? Do you remember how you got it?" She shrugged, tracing a raindrop's path down the window with her fingertip. "Mom says I was really little, like just learning to walk. I fell and hit the corner of a table." She turned to him, eyes curious. "Why?" "Just wondering," Edward replied, his heart racing. "It's funny how scars stay with us, telling stories about our past." Amelia nodded sagely, "Like a map of where you've been." As Edward drove back toward Lynn's apartment, his thoughts were a tempest. If Amelia had gotten that scar as a toddler, it couldn't be genetic, couldn't be evidence of paternity. And yet, the coincidence seemed too perfect, too exact to be random chance. Lynn was waiting anxiously at the door when they arrived, her face paling at the sight of the bandage on her daughter's chin. "What happened?" she demanded, ushering Amelia inside and examining the wound with gentle fingers. "I fell at the playground," Amelia admitted sheepishly. "But Mr. Edward took super good care of me. And guess what? He has a scar in the same place from when he was a kid too." Lynn's eyes shot to Edward's, a question in their depths that he couldn't quite interpret. "Does he now?" she murmured, her voice carefully neutral. While Amelia changed into dry clothes, Edward and Lynn stood in the cramped kitchen, speaking in hushed tones. "The doctor pointed out an old scar on her chin," Edward explained, struggling to keep his voice even. "Right where I have mine from falling out of that tree when I was 6. Lynn's expression was guarded. "Many children have chin scars, Edward. It's a common injury when they're learning to walk." "In exactly the same spot? With the same curved edge?" Edward pressed, a sudden suspicion taking root. "Lynn, is there something you're not telling me?" For a moment, Lynn seemed to waver on the edge of revelation. Then her phone chimed with an incoming message, breaking the tension. She checked the screen, her expression shifting rapidly from annoyance to shock. "It's the DNA results," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're ready." Edward's heart hammered against his ribs. That was fast. They said at least 4 weeks. Lynn nodded, looking as surprised as he felt. "I paid for expedited processing, but this is unusually quick." She looked up at him, vulnerability naked in her eyes. "I guess we're about to have our answer." The moment hung between them, heavy with possibility. After 25 years of separation, after all the pain and misunderstandings, they were minutes away from learning the truth that could reshape all their lives. "Mom," Amelia called from the bedroom. "Can I have hot chocolate? I'm freezing." Lynn broke eye contact first. "We'll go together," she decided. "Tomorrow morning. I'll call in to work." Edward nodded, the weight of anticipation settling across his shoulders. "Tomorrow, then." As he prepared to leave, Amelia rushed to hug him, her small arms wrapping tightly around his waist. "Thank you for taking care of me today," she said, her voice muffled against his coat. Edward stroked her damp hair, his throat tight with emotion. "Always," he promised, the word carrying more weight than she could possibly understand. Walking to his car through the persistent rain, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that they were all balanced on the edge of a knife. Tomorrow would bring answers, but would those answers heal their fractured past or shatter the fragile connections they'd begun to build? Either way, there would be no going back. The genetic testing center occupied the 15th floor of a gleaming glass tower in the city's medical district, a world away from Lynn's neighborhood. The elevator ride up was silent, tense, the air between Edward and Lynn thick with unspoken fears and fragile hopes. They'd left Amelia with a neighbor, telling her only that they had grown-up business to attend to. Better not to burden her with expectations that might crumble in the harsh light of scientific fact. The reception area was coldly elegant, all chrome and white surfaces designed to convey clinical precision. A receptionist with an equally precise smile, directed them to comfortable chairs while they waited for Dr. Harriet Chen, the geneticist who had processed their samples. Lynn's hands fidgeted in her lap, her fingers methodically folding and unfolding a tissue until it disintegrated into lint. Edward fought the urge to reach out, to offer comfort that wasn't his to give. Not yet, perhaps not ever. Whatever the results say, Lynn said suddenly, her voice barely audible, it doesn't change who Amelia is. It doesn't change the last 8 years. Edward nodded, understanding the complex layers beneath her statement. For Lynn, these results could validate or invalidate her long-held belief that Edward had abandoned her and their child. For him, they could offer redemption or confirm his greatest failure. For Amelia, they would shape her identity in ways she was too young to fully comprehend. Carter Millionaire, a crisp voice called from a doorway. Dr. Chen was younger than Edward had expected, with intelligent eyes behind fashionable glasses and a tablet clutched in one hand. Please follow me. Her office was as precisely arranged as the reception area, with medical diplomas displayed on one wall and a large monitor on another. Dr. Chen gestured for them to sit in the chairs facing her desk. Before we discuss the results, she began, her tone professional yet gentle, I want to clarify something unusual about your case. The samples were processed with unusual speed due to an executive override in our system. Edward frowned. I don't understand. Neither of us requested expedited service beyond the standard rush option. Dr. Chen's fingers tapped efficiently on her tablet. The override came from Marcus Wells, listed as the financial guarantor for the testing. The name hit Edward like a physical blow. Marcus Wells, my former CFO? You know him? Lynn asked sharply. He's the man who arranged my transfer to California, Edward confirmed, his mind racing. The one I suspect intercepted your letters. He turned back to Dr. Chen. How is this possible? We never involved him in this process. The doctor looked uncomfortable. Mr. Wells has been a major investor in our facility for several years. His name carries certain privileges, but I assure you his involvement has not compromised the integrity of the testing. Lynn's face had drained of color. He knows we're here. He knows we're looking for answers. Edward's jaw tightened. The brick through my car window, it was a warning. He didn't want us to pursue this. Doctor. Chen cleared her throat awkwardly. I'm not privy to any personal matters between you and Mr. Wells. My concern is strictly with the genetic analysis, which I'm prepared to discuss if you're ready. Edward and Lynn exchanged a long look. Years of mistrust and misunderstanding balanced against their mutual need for truth. Finally, Lynn nodded. We're ready, Edward confirmed. Dr. Chen's fingers moved across her tablet, sending data to the large monitor on the wall. A complex chart appeared, filled with lines, bars, and scientific terminology, beyond Edward's comprehension. We conducted a comprehensive paternity analysis comparing Mr. Milner's DNA markers with Amelia's, Dr. Chen explained, her voice shifting into lecture mode. We examined 46 chromosomes across 21 genetic markers. She paused, looking between them with clinical compassion. The results indicate a paternity probability index of 0. In layman's terms, Edward Milner is not Amelia's biological father. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through Edward's body. Despite the lingering doubt that had haunted their conversations, despite Lynn's admission about another man, he had allowed himself to hope, to believe that the uncanny resemblances, the identical scars, the connection he felt with Amelia were more than coincidence. Lynn made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sigh. You're certain? She asked, her voice hollow. The analysis is conclusive, Dr. Chen confirmed, her eyes sympathetic behind her professional mask. Would you like me to walk you through the specific markers? Edward shook his head numbly. That won't be necessary. The drive back to Lynn's apartment was excruciating in its silence. Rain had begun again, streaking the windows and blurring the world outside. Edward gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his mind churning with questions that now seemed to have only painful answers. I'm sorry, Lynn finally said as they neared her neighborhood. I truly believed there were so many similarities, and the timing. She trailed off, staring out at the rain-soaked streets. I wanted it to be true, Edward admitted, the words scraping his throat. I wanted to have someone left in this world who shared my blood, someone to make up for all my failures. Lynn's laugh was bitter, edged with decades of struggle. Amelia isn't a redemption project, Edward. She's a little girl who's already lost too much. She's grown attached to you these past weeks. How do we tell her that you're not?" She broke off, unable to finish. Edward pulled the car to the curb, unable to drive through the haze of emotions clouding his vision. "I'll disappear," he said flatly. "Clean break. It'll hurt less in the long run. Like you did 25 years ago?" Lynn's voice was sharp with sudden anger. "Just vanish without explanation, leaving us to wonder what we did wrong?" The accusation stung, all the more painful because it contained a kernel of truth. "That's not fair," he protested. "The situations are completely different." "Are they?" Lynn challenged, turning to face him fully. "You came into our lives because you were at rock bottom, ready to jump off a bridge. Now that you've gotten your answer, now that we've served our purpose in your journey of self-discovery, you're ready to walk away again." Edward recoiled as if she'd slapped him. "That's not—" "Save it." Lynn cut him off, reaching for the door handle. "We've managed 8 years without you, we'll manage the rest." Before he could respond, a sleek black sedan pulled up behind them, its headlights blazing through the rain-streaked rear window. Edward watched in the rearview mirror as a familiar figure emerged, protected from the downpour by an oversized umbrella. "Marcus," he breathed, ice forming in his veins. Lynn followed his gaze, her expression hardening. "Your former CFO?" Edward nodded grimly. "Stay in the car." Ignoring her protest, he stepped out into the rain, immediately drenched as he confronted the man who had once been his most trusted advisor, and who now stood revealed as perhaps his greatest betrayer. Marcus Wells had aged well, his salt and pepper hair expertly styled, his tailored suit declaring prosperity, even as Edward's own company crumbled. His smile was thin, practiced, revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Edward," he greeted smoothly, "I was hoping to catch you before you made any rash decisions based on today's news. You had no right to involve yourself in my personal affairs." Edward growled, rain streaming down his face and soaking his collar. Marcus's smile didn't waver. "On the contrary, I've been protecting your interests for 25 years, even when you were too blinded by sentiment to see the bigger picture." "Protecting my—" Edward broke off, rage building like a physical pressure in his chest. "You intercepted Lynn's letters. You kept me from knowing about her pregnancy. At your father's request," Marcus countered calmly. "He believed Ms. Carter was attempting to trap you into marriage with a conveniently timed pregnancy. Given today's results, it seems his instincts were correct." Lynn had emerged from the car despite Edward's warning, her eyes blazing as she approached. "You manipulative bastard," she spat. "You've been pulling strings all along, haven't you? The brick through Edward's window, the warning note, all of it was you." Marcus's expression remained impassive, though something cold flickered in his eyes. "I merely ensured that the truth came to light before any unfortunate legal entanglements could be established." He turned back to Edward. "Your father's will was quite clear. Any illegitimate child would invalidate your inheritance, which has now been legally transferred to Milner Enterprises under my management." The pieces clicked together in Edward's mind with sickening clarity. "You wanted the DNA test to prove Amelia wasn't mine. I wanted the truth," Marcus corrected smoothly. "And now you have it. Ms. Carter's daughter has no claim on the Milner fortune." His smile widened fractionally. "Now we can all move forward with our lives." The rain continued to fall around them, soaking through clothes and skin to the bone as the three adults stood locked in a triangle of decades-old secrets and fresh pain. Edward felt something break inside him, the last fragile thread of the man he'd once been, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. "This isn't over, Marcus," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot." The bridge looked different in the moonlight, more skeletal, more threatening. Edward stood on the exact spot where Amelia had found him a month ago, the 17th step of the east staircase, staring down at the dark water churning below. The irony wasn't lost on him, back where he started, considering the same desperate escape. 2 days had passed since the confrontation with Marcus, 2 days of numbing silence. Lynn had asked for space, her voice cold with fresh betrayal when she'd said, "I need time to figure out how to tell Amelia you won't be in her life anymore." The words had cut deeper than Edward had expected, leaving a wound that seemed to widen with each passing hour. He leaned against the railing, feeling the cold metal bite into his palms. The DNA test results had shattered whatever fragile hope he'd been nurturing. Amelia wasn't his daughter. The identical chin scars, The similar mannerisms, the connection he'd felt. All coincidences. Cruel jokes played by a universe that seemed determined to remind him of everything he'd lost. Edward pulled out his phone and opened the photo gallery. He'd taken dozens of pictures with Amelia over the past month. At the park, making pancakes in Lynn's tiny kitchen. Playing board games on rainy afternoons. In each one, the girl's smile was radiant, trusting, filled with a joy that had begun to seep into Edward's own frozen heart. "Not my blood," he whispered to the night air, "but still somehow mine." The realization hit him with unexpected force. Regardless of DNA, regardless of biology, he'd grown to love this child. In just 1 month, she'd become more important to him than the fortune he'd lost, the company that had been stolen, the life he'd built and watched crumble. A rustling sound made him turn. The staircase behind him was empty, but something white fluttered near his feet, an envelope that hadn't been there moments before. Edward picked it up, turning it over in his hands. His name was written on the front in childish, careful letters. With fingers that suddenly trembled, he opened the envelope and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in colorful crayon drawings and large, painstakingly formed words. "Dear Mr. Edward," it began. "Mom says you won't be visiting anymore because of grown-up reasons. She won't tell me the grown-up reasons, but her eyes get red when I ask. So I stopped asking." Edward's throat tightened painfully. "I know you're not my real dad now," the letter continued. "Mom finally told me. She said my real dad was someone else who went away before I was born. But I want you to know something really important." Edward had to stop, blinking rapidly against the burn of tears. He took a deep breath and continued reading. "You saw me when no one else did. You heard me when no one listened. You made me feel like I mattered. Isn't that what real dads do? My friend Zoe has 2 dads because her mom got married again. She says her stepdad is more real than her birth dad because he's actually there." The simple wisdom of childhood struck Edward like a physical blow. He leaned heavily against the railing, the letter trembling in his hands. "I left this letter on the special step because Mom says this is where you two made promises a long time ago. I'm making a promise too. I'll wait for you to come back, even if it takes a long time." The final page contained a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands, a tall man in a blue suit, a woman with red hair, and a small girl between them. Above the drawing, in wobbly letters, was written, "My family." Edward pressed the papers to his chest, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't name. How had she known he would come here tonight? Had she been leaving this letter every evening hoping he would return to the bridge? The thought of Amelia faithfully placing her heart's plea on this cold step, night after night, shattered something inside him. "She's quite remarkable, isn't she?" Edward whirled around. Lynn stood a few steps below, her hands thrust deep into the pockets of her worn jacket, her expression unreadable in the shadows. "You knew she left this?" Edward asked, carefully folding the letter back into its envelope. Lynn climbed the remaining steps until she stood beside him. "She's been writing to you every day since we got the test results. I caught her sneaking out last night to leave one of her letters." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "She said the 17th step was magic because it's where I found you and where you found her." "Lynn," Edward began, his voice rough with emotion. "I never meant to—" "I know," she interrupted, her eyes fixed on the dark water below. "None of us meant for any of this to happen. Not you, not me." She paused. "Maybe not even Marcus." Edward stiffened. "What do you mean?" Lynn turned to face him fully, her expression resolute in the dim light. "I've been thinking about what he said, about your father's will and the inheritance. Something didn't add up." She pulled a folded document from her pocket. "So I did some digging. Called in a favor from a friend who works at the courthouse." Edward took the paper, squinting to read it in the meager light. It was a copy of a legal document, his father's will, filed 27 years ago. "Look at section 12, Lynn directed, her finger pointing to a specific paragraph. Edward read aloud, his voice growing more incredulous with each word. "Any child born out of wedlock shall be excluded from inheritance unless formally acknowledged by the testator prior to his death." He looked up sharply. "This isn't the version I was given. The copy I have specifically invalidates the entire inheritance if an illegitimate child is discovered." "Exactly," Lynn said grimly. "Someone altered the will, and there's only one person who stood to benefit from that alteration. Marcus," Edward breathed, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. He changed the will to ensure I'd never acknowledge any child born outside my marriage. Another realization hit him. The DNA test, what if he tampered with that too? Lynn's expression was carefully controlled. I've been wondering the same thing. The timing was too convenient, the results processed too quickly, and there's something else. She hesitated. I received a call today from someone who used to work at your father's company. A woman named Eleanor Jenkins. The name sparked a distant memory. My father's executive assistant? Lynn nodded. She retired years ago, but she's been following the news about Millionaire Enterprises. When she saw your name linked with mine in some society gossip column, she reached out. Lynn's voice dropped lower. She says she remembers me from when I worked there. She also remembers being instructed to redirect any correspondence from me directly to Marcus Wells. Edward's hands clenched into fists. So he did intercept your letters. Yes, but that's not all. Lynn took a deep breath. Eleanor says she overheard a conversation between Marcus and your father shortly before your transfer to California. Your father was insisting that you be told about my pregnancy. Marcus convinced him to wait, said he would handle it more delicately than your father could. The implications crashed over Edward like a wave. My father knew? He wanted me to know? According to Eleanor, yes. Lynn's eyes held a mixture of sadness and determination. She says your father wasn't the monster you believed him to be. Strict, old-fashioned, concerned about appearances. Yes, but not cruel enough to separate a man from his child. Edward turned away, bracing his hands against the railing as decades of resentment toward his father crumbled beneath this new revelation. All these years, he whispered. All these years I blamed him for everything. While Marcus manipulated you both, Lynn finished. And he's still manipulating us now. Edward straightened, a cold clarity settling over him. We need another DNA test, one that Marcus can't interfere with. Already arranged, Lynn said, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. Eleanor has connections at a private lab in Boston. The samples were sent this morning under pseudonyms. Edward stared at her with newfound admiration. The timid, exhausted woman he'd reunited with a month ago had been replaced by a fierce, determined fighter, a mother protecting what was hers. Why are you doing this? He asked softly. After everything that's happened, why help me now? Lynn was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the envelope in Edward's hand. Because Amelia loves you, she finally said, and because I think deep down, I never stopped loving the man you were before Marcus Wells and your father's legacy twisted everything between us. The confession hung in the night air between them, as delicate and unexpected as the first snowflake of winter. Edward reached out slowly, giving Lynn every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, he took her hand, feeling the roughness of calluses earned through years of hard work, years he should have shared. Whatever the new test shows, he said quietly, I'm not walking away again. Not from Amelia, and not from you, if you'll let me stay. Lynn's fingers tightened around his. The 17th step, she murmured, where promises are made and kept. Above them, the clouds parted briefly, allowing a shaft of moonlight to illuminate the spot where they stood. The same spot where, 25 years earlier, they had sworn impossible things to each other. The same spot where, a month ago, a small girl had saved a desperate man from the abyss. The same spot where, perhaps, a new beginning was finally possible. Spring had come early to the city, breathing life into the urban landscape with unexpected bursts of green, pushing through concrete cracks and tentative blooms dotting the trees along the riverfront. The bridge, once the site of Edward's darkest moment, now gleamed with fresh paint, part of a city revitalization project that had transformed the once neglected structure. Edward stood at the base of the newly renovated staircase, a bouquet of wildflowers clutched in one hand, the other holding an envelope bearing the logo of a prestigious Boston laboratory. 6 months had passed since that night on the 17th step. 6 months of rebuilding, of careful trust, of legal battles and unexpected allies. Eleanor Jenkins had proven invaluable, her meticulous record-keeping providing the evidence they needed to challenge Marcus Wells's control of Millionaire Enterprises. The falsified will, the intercepted letters, the years of calculated manipulation, all had been brought to light in a legal showdown that had dominated business news for weeks. Marcus now faced criminal charges, his carefully constructed empire crumbling beneath the weight of his own deceit. But those victories, significant as they were, paled in comparison to what was contained in the envelope Edward now held. The second DNA test, conducted with rigorous oversight far from Marcus's influence, had arrived that morning. Edward had waited, wanting Lynn and Amelia to be with him when he learned the truth, whatever it might be. As if summoned by his thoughts, they appeared at the top of the bridge, walking hand in hand. Amelia spotted him first, her face lighting up with unrestrained joy as she broke free from her mother's grasp and raced down the steps toward him. "Edward! Edward!" she called, her voice carrying on the spring breeze. "We got ice cream. Mom let me have 2 scoops because I got all A's on my report card." Edward crouched down, opening his arms to receive her enthusiastic hug. Over the past months, they'd settled into a comfortable routine. Weekend visits, movie nights, helping with homework. He'd become a fixture in Amelia's life, a role he cherished regardless of biology. "2 scoops, huh?" he teased, ruffling her hair. "Sounds like someone's been working hard at school." Lynn approached more slowly, her smile gentle as she watched them together. The months had been kind to her. The perpetual exhaustion that had lined her face when they'd first reunited had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment that made her look years younger. She'd reduced her warehouse shifts after Edward had helped her secure a better-paying administrative position at a local community college. "Are those for me?" Lynn asked, nodding toward the wildflowers. Edward stood, suddenly awkward despite the ease that had grown between them. "For both of you, actually. I thought we might need something to celebrate, or something to soften a disappointment." Lynn's gaze fell to the envelope in his hand, understanding dawning in her eyes. "It's here? The results?" Edward nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Arrived this morning." Amelia looked between them, her perceptive eyes narrowing. "Is that the special letter? The one that tells if you're really my dad?" The straightforward question, delivered with a child's blunt honesty, made both adults freeze. They'd been careful not to raise Amelia's hopes, explaining that Edward would remain in their lives regardless of what any test might say. Still, the girl was far too intelligent not to understand the significance of this moment. "Yes, sweetheart," Lynn finally answered, kneeling to meet her daughter's gaze. "But remember what we talked about, no matter what it says." "Edward stays," Amelia finished firmly, "because families aren't just about blood. They're about who loves you and who shows up when you need them." She looked up at Edward, her expression suddenly vulnerable beneath its certainty. "Right?" Edward felt his heart constrict with a love so fierce it bordered on pain. "Absolutely right," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "Nothing in this envelope changes that. Nothing." Lynn straightened, squaring her shoulders as if preparing for a blow. "Well then," she said, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture, "I think it's time we know for sure." Edward nodded, carefully opening the envelope with fingers that trembled slightly. The paper inside was crisp, official, filled with scientific terminology and data points beyond his comprehension. But there, highlighted in yellow at the bottom of the page, was the only sentence that mattered. Paternity index, 99.99998%. The alleged father, Edward James Milner, cannot be excluded as the biological father of the tested child, Amelia Lynn Carter. The world seemed to tilt beneath Edward's feet. He read the line again and again, unable to fully grasp the magnitude of what it confirmed. All these years, all the separation, the loss, the might-have-beens, all orchestrated by Marcus's manipulations. "Edward?" Lynn's voice seemed to come from far away. "What does it say?" He looked up, finding himself unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. Instead, he simply handed her the paper, watching as she read it once, twice, her hand flying to her mouth as the implications sank in. "It's positive," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "You are her father. You always were." Amelia, impatient with adult hesitation, tugged at the paper. "Let me see." Lynn knelt again, showing their daughter the highlighted section and explaining in simple terms what it meant. Amelia's reaction was not what either of them expected. Rather than excitement or joy, her small face scrunched into a thoughtful frown. "I knew it," she declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. "I told you we had the same thinking wrinkle." She pointed to the space between her eyebrows, then to Edward's matching furrow. "And the same scar." Her finger moved to her chin. "And we both like the crusts cut off our sandwiches." The simplicity of her acceptance. as if the scientific confirmation was merely an afterthought to what she had already known in her heart, broke something open inside Edward. A laugh bubbled up from deep within him, releasing decades of tension, of regret, of what-ifs. Lynn was laughing too, tears streaming down her face as she pulled Amelia into a hug. "Yes, sweetheart, you were right all along." Edward joined them, wrapping his arms around both of them, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. The family he'd never known he had, the future he'd nearly thrown away on that bridge 6 months ago. "There's something else," he said when they finally separated, emotion making his voice unsteady. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. "I was going to give this to you regardless of what the test said, but now—" He took a deep breath. "Lynn Carter, will you marry me? Not because of Amelia, not because of the past, but because I want to build a future with you, with both of you." Lynn stared at the box, her expression a complex mixture of shock, joy, and lingering caution. "Edward, are you sure? After everything—" "I've never been more sure of anything," he interrupted gently. "We've lost 25 years. I don't want to waste another minute." Before Lynn could answer, Amelia bounced excitedly between them. "Say yes, Mom. Say yes." Lynn laughed, the sound bright and free in the spring air. "Well, I can't argue with both of you, can I?" She looked up at Edward, her eyes shining with a happiness he'd once thought impossible. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." As Edward slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple emerald that matched her eyes, not the ostentatious diamond his former self would have chosen, he felt something settle inside him, a sense of rightness, of coming home after a very long journey. "Wait," Amelia said suddenly, her expression serious. "We have to go to the special step. That's where promises happen." Edward and Lynn exchanged a look of understanding. Hand in hand, the three of them climbed the staircase, stopping at the 17th step. The newly painted surface gleamed in the afternoon sun, no longer the site of despair but of renewal. "Here," Amelia declared with satisfaction. "Now it's official." Edward knelt down, bringing himself to his daughter's level. "Amelia," he said solemnly, "I promise to be the father you deserve, to love you, protect you, and be there for you every day for the rest of my life." Amelia nodded, equally solemn, before breaking into a wide grin. "I know you will. That's why I saved you." "Saved me?" Edward repeated, confused. "On the bridge that night," she explained, as if it were obvious. "Mom always said the 17th step was magic, that it was where promises live. I knew if I found you there, the magic would work." Lynn's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Amelia, how did you even know to look for Edward that night?" The girl shrugged, the mystery apparently simple in her mind. "I saw his picture under your pillow, and I heard you crying, so I asked the step to bring him back, and it did." She looked between their astonished faces. "Don't you see? The 17th step kept your promise, Mom. You said you'd give him a chance if he ever came back." In that moment, standing on a bridge that had nearly been his end and was now his beginning, Edward understood something profound about the nature of promises, of second chances, of the invisible threads that connect people across time and space. Whether it was magic or coincidence or the desperate prayer of a child that had brought him to this bridge 6 months ago, he would be forever grateful. "Now," Amelia declared, taking each of their hands in hers, "the step isn't for sad things anymore. It's for happy things, for family things." As they stood together on the 17th step, the spring sun warm on their faces and the future stretching bright before them, Edward knew with absolute certainty that the bridge had delivered him not to an ending, but to the beginning he had always been meant to find. Edward's journey from the edge of despair to the embrace of a family he never knew existed reminds us that sometimes our darkest moments can lead to our greatest blessings. When he stood on that bridge, ready to end it all, he couldn't have imagined that a small girl's words would not only save his life but give him a reason to truly live again. What might we be missing in our own lives when we believe all hope is lost? What unexpected connections might be waiting to save us, if only we take one more step forward instead of stepping into the abyss? The 17th step became more than just a place on a bridge. It became a symbol of promises kept, of second chances, and of the invisible threads that connect us to those we're meant to find. In a world where we often feel isolated by our pain, Edward and Lynn's story reminds us that our greatest wounds can sometimes lead us to our deepest healing. Would you have the courage to reach across decades of hurt, to reclaim a love that was stolen? Would you recognize a miracle disguised as coincidence? Or would you walk away from the very thing your heart has been searching for? If this story touched your heart, remember that someone else might need to hear it too. Follow our channel for more stories that illuminate the depths of human experience. And don't forget to like and share with those who might need a reminder that even at our lowest points, redemption may be just one step away, perhaps even on the 17th step of a bridge where promises live.